Welcome to the latest edition of Don't Take This as Gospel. I'm Mike Partika, and today we are talking about the divided exile. Now, in my last video for Don't Take This as Gospel, called The Divided Messiah, we talked about this passage from Luke 4 16 through 21, where Jesus reads from the scroll of Isaiah this passage, and this passage is something he does not read completely. He reads the passage that applies to himself, but leaves out this portion about "and the day of vengeance of our God," as though basically saying, I'm only fulfilling the prophecies up to this point. Now, that's one of the major objections that Jews have to accepting Jesus as the Messiah, is that he has not fulfilled all of the messianic prophecies, and one of these being bringing about the day of vengeance of God. Now, the way that Christians get around that is they say, okay, look, we understand that in a Messiah, you're not just looking for a suffering servant, you're also looking for a warrior king. But here's the thing: Jesus is going to come twice, and in his first coming, he's fulfilling the role of the suffering servant, and then in his second coming, he will fulfill the role of the warrior king. And so that's how they're basically saying that Jesus is going to fulfill all the messianic prophecies. He doesn't fulfill them all in his first coming, but at the end of history, we're kicking the can down the road. We are going to see him fulfill the rest of the messianic prophecies in his second coming. And what we learn from the book The Search for Messiah by Mark Eastman and Chuck Smith is that the rabbis also had difficulty with the idea of a Messiah who would both be the suffering servant, who would even die, and then also being the reigning king. And the way that they handled that is to divide the Messiah into two people, so that he's not just one Messiah, the one we've come to know as the Son of David, but he's actually two Messiahs. There's two people, one of whom is the son of Joseph, who fulfills the suffering servant prophecies, and then the son of David, who will be the reigning warrior king. And I found confirmation of that in Jewish commentaries, even on the books of Isaiah and Ezekiel. Now, there are some who are still going to call this dirty pool, though, because what right do you have, what right did even Jesus have, to take a verse from Isaiah and split it in two and say, okay, look, this part is going to refer to the past, or in Jesus' case, when he was saying it, the present, but to Christians, it's the past. This is the past prophecies and such that Jesus fulfilled, and then take the rest of the sentence, the day of vengeance of our God, and shoot that off into the future, as though you can just take a verse and indiscriminately split it in two and say, this refers to the past, this refers to the future. Can you really do that? Do we have examples of anyone else ever doing that, say, within Judaism? Well, one of the things that I noticed in the book of Isaiah is that there was a portion of the commentary on Isaiah chapter 19 which mentions a rabbi, or, well, not necessarily a rabbi, but he was a Jewish commentator who is called Don Isaac Abarbanel, and he lived from 1437 to 1508. And he notes that all the prophecies in this chapter, chapter 19, regarding Egypt and Assyria were not fulfilled during the days of Hezekiah, nor during the era of the Second Temple. He therefore suggests that the prophecies refer to the Messianic era. Now, in order to understand what this particular commentary is saying in this particular passage, I need to give you a quick rundown of Jewish history and the Jewish covenant. See, when Moses freed the slaves from Egypt, or God, using Moses, freed the slaves from Egypt, God made a covenant through the law that he handed to Moses and said, look, I am going to give you this land of Israel. It's a great land. You're going to love it. It's going to be this fantastic place. And so long as you obey my law, so long as you are good people who obey my law, I am going to give you this land to keep, and you will live in there peacefully, and you will have food, and you will have fun, and you will have loads of children, and everything that you ever wanted is going to be yours. It's going to be great, so long as you keep my law. But if you don't keep my law, if you turn into a bunch of little devils, I'm going to get rid of you from Israel. I'm going to exile you from Israel, and I'm going to send you to live in these neighboring countries where you will live under oppression and you will not be able to live under your own guidance and freedom and such, and you will suffer there until you repent, at which point I will bring you back in. And I will bring you back in until such time as you go astray again. And, the cycle will repeat itself. So, if you look at Jewish history in a nutshell, what you're going to see is we can divide Jewish history into 6 eras. The first era being the pre temple era, this being from Moses to David. Of course, I'm leaving out the times that the Jews were slaves in Egypt. This is basically as they existed as a nation. So you have the pre-temple era that existed from Moses to David. The Israelites go to the promised land. They set up shop and they start uh, conquering the land. They don't completely conquer it, but they at least have a good portion of it under their control. And by the time David dies, you get into the first temple era, which is the really first good heyday of uh, Israel. These are the golden years when you start with Solomon, who builds the temple, the first temple at Jerusalem, and this is the golden age, the very first golden age. Now, of course, the Israelites fall into sin. They start worshiping idols. They do all this stuff that is a violation of God's law, and that leads to the first exile, which is called the Babylonian exile. Now, the Babylonian exile basically lasts about 70 years, and during this time, they're in Babylon. They're having to, establish lives for themselves, and the 10 tribes. There's 12 tribes of Israel. Judah and Benjamin have maintained themselves relatively intact within the Babylonian Empire, but the rest of the 10 tribes, the other 10 tribes, they've been basically scattered to the winds, and nobody really knows what has become of them. So at the end of this first exile, you do have a second temple era because King Cyrus of Babylon, he gets a vision from God saying, hey, okay, the Jews have suffered enough. It's 70 years. Go ahead and let them back into their country. And so Cyrus returns some of the Jews to the land of Israel, and they build a new temple to replace the one that was destroyed. It's not as good a temple as that particular the one that they had before. It's lacking some features, but that is the second temple era, and it lasts from the end of that Babylonian exile all the way up to around the time of Jesus. And then a few decades after the time of Jesus, you have the destruction of that temple and the scattering of the Jews who are now under the Roman Empire throughout the Roman Empire. And this is called the Roman exile. And the Roman exile continues to this day. Even though Israel is now a country again, it's not a theocracy like it was under the first and second temple eras to the extent that they could be theocracies. They did their best, but right now it's just a secular nation, and the Jews having returned there, it doesn't really count until you get the third temple era, which is still off into the future. Now, this is what's often called the Messianic era or the Messianic Age, and this is when the Messiah is supposed to come and conquer Israel again and make sure that everybody's secure in Israel, and this will be the golden age that lasts forever. Now, so when you look at this commentary by Abarbanel, where he says all the prophecies in this chapter, chapter 19, regarding Egypt and Assyria, were not fulfilled during the days of Hezekiah nor during the era of the Second Temple. When he talks about during the days of Hezekiah, that's during the First Temple era. And then he explicitly refers to the Second Temple era, and then when he sees that the prophecies in this chapter were not fulfilled in either of those times, he then suggests kicking the can down the road to the Messianic era and saying, well, this chapter must really apply to that third temple era. So when you go and look at the history, he's basically saying that the prophecies in Isaiah chapter 19 don't occur in the first temple era, they don't occur in the second temple era, they have to occur in the third temple era. Therefore, I mean, it's just ipso facto, the logic holds. Now, this strikes me as being the same kind of thing that goes on in Luke chapter 4, verse 16 through 21, where Jesus is basically saying, look, the day of vengeance of our God, that's not something I'm going to be fulfilling now. This is a can I'm going to kick down the road to my second coming. And that's when this particular prophecy will be fulfilled. Now, the issue here is that if you look at when Isaiah was prophesying all this, Isaiah lived around the end of the first temple era. And he's prophesying about things and he's prophesying it apparently in a way that is so unclear that you can't even know from what he's prophesying whether he's talking about the first temple era, the second temple era, or the third temple era. You have no idea. So it kind of makes you wonder when you realize how nebulous these prophecies are. You got to wonder, are there any other prophets who become subject to this kind of same nebulous interpretation where you don't really know when these prophecies are supposed to be taking place? Well, as it happens, I started looking in the book of Jeremiah, and this is the ArtScroll commentary on Jeremiah. Now, Jeremiah lived at the end of the first temple era, and he saw it through into the beginning of the Babylonian exile. And he was the one who gave the Jews the message, hey guys, we're going to be here a while. He was basically communicating, his main message to the Jews was, we're not going back to Israel anytime soon. We've got at least 70 years before we're going to go back. We're not going to be just 5 years out and then we're heading back home. So go ahead and get comfortable. Go ahead and build businesses. Go ahead and have children. Go ahead and live lives here in Babylon because we're not going back to Israel anytime soon. So speaking of those 70 years, in the commentary on Jeremiah chapter 29, we have Abarbanel again explaining that the return after 70 years, that's the end of the Babylonian exile, should not be understood as the fulfillment of the prophecies of the final redemption. Why? Because obviously it wasn't the final redemption, because the 10 tribes, you'll remember, these are the 10 tribes that were scattered out throughout, and we just basically have lost all track of them. They were not brought back at the end of the first exile, and the second temple did not have the holy ark. So we're looking at compared to the first temple, a defective temple, and we're also looking at not enough of the population. So thus, the era of the second temple was only a partial redemption. And so basically what we're saying here is that we're looking, from their perspective, we've got this pre-temple era, you've got the first temple era, and then they get scattered in the exile, and then you're looking forward to the second temple era, and you are expecting it to be a golden age much like the first temple era was. But what you actually get is something more of a mixture. You've got some of the Israelites returning to Israel, but you've still got the rest who are scattered throughout Babylon. Some of them are identifiable. These are the nations of Judah and Benjamin who still have retained their Jewish identity, but then you've also got the 10 tribes who are like scattered all throughout the world, and you have no idea where they are now. So the Second Temple era really didn't measure up to what anybody thought it was. And so when Abarbanel was talking about these particular prophecies and saying, look, you can't apply the prophecies of the final redemption, it's because, if you had the final redemption, you'd have this great, glorious golden age, but what you really got was this mediocre age in the Second Temple era, followed by a second exile, and then sometime out in the future, you're going to have the actual golden age that is being referred to here. And so that's this kind of thinking, this kind of splitting it off and kicking the can down the road to the Messianic era affects how Jewish commentators see other verses in, say, Jeremiah, like Jeremiah chapter 31. You have a short passage here, and this is actually referred to in the New Testament. Some of you might recognize it from the Gospel of Matthew, but it's a prophecy that says, Rachel weeps for her children, for they are gone. Well, this is a reference to the exile. But the Lord says, they will return from the enemy's land. There is hope for your future, and your children will return to their border. Well, if you look at the Jewish commentaries on this, you see that the rabbis take this and they split this section into two. And they say the end of the verse 15, but the Lord says they will return from the enemy's land. This refers to the end of the first exile. But the next verse, there is hope for your future and your children will return to their border. They push that into the end of the second exile. For some reason, I'm not really sure why. But it gets even worse than that. In commentary on Jeremiah chapter 30, now understand, we've gone here to a particular section and we've split off verses. Here, we're looking at a particular verse, and Jacob will return and be at peace and be tranquil. Well, Abarbanel strikes again and says, and Jacob will return refers to the repatriation from Babylon, in which only exiles from Judah returned. The phrase, and be at peace and be tranquil, refers to the final messianic redemption. Peace being Judah, tranquil being the exiles from the remaining tribes. Those are the 10 tribes. Now look what he did. He split a verse into two. He split a verse into a past and a present, or a past and a future section, saying that the first section refers to the past exile and the end of the first exile, and then this next portion refers to the future at the end of the second exile. And this is exactly the same kind of split that Jesus does in the New Testament. So if somebody's going to complain and say, hey, Jesus went and split this verse right in the middle, well, so did these guys. They are not above doing the same thing. But the real problem I want you to see here, because this is very, very important, is that you've got these three prophets, the major prophets, Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah. These are all prophets who lived around the end of the First Temple era into the Babylonian exile, and they all prophesied about this Messianic era in which all the Jews would be brought back, the end of exile where all the Jews would be brought back, and there would be this glorious temple, and everything would be wonderful. And that's what they prophesy about. And you never get the impression, when you're just reading them straight out, straight on, you never get the impression that they have any clue that there is the Second Temple era followed by a second exile era. Rather, if you look at them and you just read through them as they are, the only real impression you get is that, yes, here is this terrible Babylonian exile that we're in, but then it's going to be followed by this Second Temple era, and that Second Temple era is going to be the Messianic era. And it's only because the Second Temple era did not turn out to be the glorious Messianic era that was expected that we wind up splitting out or shoehorning in to this history, this very, very simple history that is prophesied by Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah. You wind up having to fit in the Second Temple era and the Second Exile era and push the Third Temple era, or push what was the Second Temple era into being a Third Temple era. You have to kick the can down the road and provide this new picture of history so that you don't have failed prophecies, you just have delayed prophecies. It's just like in the case of Jesus. Did he fulfill all of the messianic prophecies? No. So what do we say? If you're a Christian, you say, well, that's because it's his first coming. He fulfilled all those prophecies. Anything he didn't fulfill, he is going to fulfill when he comes back. Same thing is happening here. We look at the end of the first exile and they look at history and they say, okay, Did we enter the Messianic era? Well, no. Why? Because these prophecies, all of these prophecies that we had about the end of exile, that all of these major prophets were telling us, some of them didn't come to pass. Well, what does that mean? Well, I guess we got to kick the can down the road because we don't want to say that these prophets were wrong. So we're going to say that some of these prophecies referred to the end of the first exile, but some of these prophecies actually refer to the end of the second exile when there's going to be a third temple era. We're just kicking the can down the road in the same way. Second coming, pushing all these first coming type things or only coming type things into a first and second coming. Now you've got this second temple era that gets divided into a second and a third. So just as there was a divided Messiah, we also have a divided exile. So next time you're reading through the Bible, read through it. See if I'm right. See if you get the same impression I did, that they really were only talking about one particular exile and thinking that at the end of that, that's when the Messianic era was coming. But then, you got to deal with reality at some point, and you deal with it the only way you know how. Well, it's not a failed prophecy, it's just a delayed prophecy. Thank you for watching. I'm Mike Partika. Please do subscribe if you haven't already so that you can catch the next episode of Don't Take This as Gospel, as well as any of my other content. And I will talk to you later.